Hello and welcome to my channel. If you've seen my previous video, you know that I did a scene very similar to this one, only in graphite pencil. This time I'm going to do it in colored pencil. So let me show you how it was done. Now first I'm going to say a few words about the materials. As you can see, I sketched out the shape of the mountain in the distance, and now I'm going to work on the sky. I'm using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. Those are the ones that I have. They're pretty good. I'm not saying you have to use those, but like I said, those are my favorite ones. The surface I'm working on, however, this time is a sanded paper. It's 1000 grit sandpaper. You can buy this at any hardware store. It just has to be fine sandpaper, something like a 1000 grit or a 1200 grit or something like that. Anyway, the first thing I did was to lay down some light gray pencil, and in order to be able to blend it, you need to put down enough of the material. Basically, you need to cover the area you're coloring fairly thoroughly. Now, the reason why I'm able to do this, the reason why I'm able to blend like this, is because colored pencils on sanded paper behave differently than they do on regular paper, meaning that they create a little bit more residue that can be moved around, and they can be blended a bit more easily. They can also be layered more easily, which is another huge advantage of this textured surface. And now you can see that I'm putting in a touch of blue to some of these areas which I already blended. Obviously, even though colored pencils behave a little bit more similar to pastel pencils on this sanded surface, they are not quite as good as pastels when it comes to covering large areas or blending, but it is quite a bit easier, in my opinion, than it is on regular paper. For blending, I normally use these hard bristle brushes. I just buy the cheapest ones that I can find, and the sandpaper does wear them down eventually, but you know, you just buy multiple brushes and use them for different colors, and when they run out, when they're spent, you just replace them with another one. Anyway, the background color of my paper is kind of a warm gray, so when I blend, a little bit of that color of the paper breaks through the light layer of color that I've applied, which is why I often go back and reapply some of the lighter colors on top, either a light gray or even a touch of that light sky blue, which I used occasionally because I want the sky to be of slightly cooler color. And like I said, the background color of my paper is a little bit like a warm gray, so I want it a little bit cooler. The good thing about Faber-Castell Polychromos is that I can find them locally and I can buy them separately. So I can buy the colors that I need, and I have a good range of these light grays. I have warm grays, but in this particular drawing I'm going to be using cool grays. I'm going to be using two light cool grays. One of them is very light, the one that I'm using here. It's almost white, it's just slightly off white, and the other one is a little bit darker, but I'm going to use both. Now for this mountain and in the distance, I'm going to use a little bit of this mid-tone gray and some brownish tones, as well as some other tones. But the idea is to have a rough, dark shape against that lighter background of the sky. Now, let me get back to what I said in the intro. In my last video, if you've been following my channel, you know that I did a scene like this. In my last video, I did a drawing like this in graphite pencil, and it was also of smaller size. I worked on a Fabriano sketching paper. Now I'm working on 1000 grit sandpaper. So I added touches of brown and even a little bit of light beige for some of the lighter parts of the mountain. And I did a bit more additional blending with a brush, and then I went around the edge with light gray pencil to make sure that I have a clean edge between the top edge of the mountain and the background. So I wanted to experiment and to try to do the same scene or a similar scene in two different techniques. First I did a sort of a study in graphite where I used a simpler to use medium, which is graphite. It's black and white, it's simpler, and I also picked a smaller size, which is also a very important factor. Whenever you're not sure about something, you can go for a smaller size and learn on that and experiment with that. And then I decided to try it out with colored pencils. So one of the biggest challenges here will be creating these misty effects or foggy effects, because this is one of those foggy scenes where we'll have the mountain peaks and the top part of the trees kind of popping out of the mist, and the valleys and the bottom part of the trees will be enveloped in that mist. But to achieve that effect, I'm going to have to layer a number of these light grays as well as a touch of white here and there, and I'll also have to do a little bit more blending. Once again, for blending, I'm using hard bristle brushes. I just push the pigment around and I allow it to go into those darker spaces where where the pencil didn't reach. Anyway, I'm drawing some more trees on the top of this slope to the left. I started with a bit of black pencil and then I added a bit of green on top of it. The good thing about this surface is that you can go back and forth between lighter and darker pencils. Basically, you can work from light to dark as well as from dark to light. And you can layer them, you can put in multiple layers, which means that you can easily modify colors. If you want to create a darker color, you just go in with a dark color, like maybe even a black colored pencil, which I often use for the trees, and I just put some green on top of it, and it creates a dark green. That's because colored pencils do blend on this surface, and they blend a lot better than they do on regular paper. On regular paper, colored pencils don't really blend. You sort of have to layer them, and those overlapping marks have to create an illusion of a new color that's a combination of the two colors that you used. But on this surface it works a little bit differently, and like I said, the process is a bit more similar to the way that pastel pencils are used, except for the fact that colored pencils, as I've already mentioned, clearly do not smudge quite as well, because they have more binder and because they stick to the surface of the paper a little bit better, and which is also an advantage of colored pencils, because you don't have to worry about fixing them, because when I put down these tiny marks, it won't really smudge even if I touch it with my finger. It can be blended, but in order to blend it you have to use, well, a little bit more force, a little bit more pressure, and a harder brush or a tortillon or something like that. You'll notice that every now and then I go over those foggy details with a blue pencil, just to retain those cooler bluish tones. Anyway, here I decided to block in some larger, lighter areas. Whenever you're drawing landscape or any other drawing for that matter, you can choose two different approaches. You can start from a detail, or you can start from larger relationships between areas of lighter and darker value, or you can use a combination of the two approaches. I normally like to use a combination of these two approaches, which is what I did in the top part of the scene. Now, for this middle part of the scene, I'm going to go with the first approach of laying down the larger values, or the blocking in the larger areas first. So I'm doing that with this large foggy area between the two slopes, and I'm filling that in with the light cool gray. Then I'm going to blend that, and then I'm going to start refining some of the details. I even added a touch of white pencil in some of those areas where I felt like I needed a little bit more of that additional lighter color. And then I'm just blending that thoroughly, and here and there I can dab on some parts of it with a kneaded eraser to make the fog look a bit more transparent. So basically I lift up a little bit of that lighter color. so that the darker layers underneath will show through. But the whole layering and blending process, or the coloring and the blending process, is a little bit slower with colored pencil than it is with some other media, which is why if you try to do this in pastel, it would be a little bit quicker. But obviously colored pencils have some advantages of their own. The main advantage for me is the fact that I don't have to fix them afterward, or I can use barely any fixative, unlike the pastels, which can smudge rather easily, and when you try to fix them you always have to worry about the loss of detail and the color change and things like that, which can be kind of ugly. But with colored pencils you don't really have that problem. And another advantage of colored pencils is that they're really good for details and for fine textures. So no medium is perfect. I just chose to do this particular scene in colored pencil after I initially did it in graphite. I think the graphite pencil scene turned out pretty well. It's a nice little sketch. This one is a slightly larger size. I forgot to mention that this one is 9 by 11 inches in size, so a little bit larger. It's a decent sized landscape already, not exactly a miniature. And now I'm working on that slope to the left, and I'm covering it with a little bit of dark green. This is the chromium dark green, or whatever it's called in the Faber-Castell range. It's kind of a, let's say, a slightly yellowish darker green, but not that yellowish, because I also used a little bit of the yellowish earth green, or darker yellowish green, whatever it's called, which was a little bit too yellowish for me. So this one is a little bit cooler in hue, and I like this one better for both the terrain and the trees, which I'm going to do later. Here and there I add some other greens as well, so I was kind of playing around with colors. You don't have to use, if you want to recreate something like this, you don't have to use all of the colors that I used. I was just sort of playing around with colors. I mean, since I already decided to work in colored pencil, because the first one was black and white, I just wanted to play around a little bit and see what I can come up with. Anyway, in order for some of these foggy effects to work, they have to be blended, and when I blend I kind of push those that lighter pigment from the lighter areas onto the darker areas, and that way I can create those semi-transparent effects. Now here I'm drawing another row of trees going down that slope. These are a little bit darker than the row of trees behind it. Those behind them are barely visible because only the top of the trees are kind of showing through the mist. These are going to be a little bit darker and also a little bit better defined because there's less fog around them and in front of them. And on this higher part of the slope we're also going to have some scattered trees or groups of trees, and those are also going to be clearly visible, whereas at the bottom of the slope in the valley we're going to have more of the mist. So the way that I draw these trees is fairly simple. I want them to look like coniferous evergreen trees as seen from a distance, so something like fir trees, and I just draw a vertical line to give myself an idea about the overall size and the positioning of the tree, and then I work on the horizontal shapes, adding some branches and clusters of needles and things like that. But it's not a very complex shape. It's just a bunch of small lines that create sort of a conical tapering shape that kind of looks like an evergreen tree. And the ones that are further back obviously don't need to be defined at all. They just look like small darker shapes on that slope. I'm also dragging my pencil here and there on that slope, trying to create a little bit of variation and value. But here at the bottom you can see how I'm drawing these trees so that they're kind of half finished they just disappear in that fog, but I don't want them to disappear all of a sudden like it's thick smoke. It's going to be kind of semi-transparent at the bottom, so I'm going to get to that a little bit later. Right now I'm using the light yellowish green to add some lighter details to that slope, maybe a little bit of variation in the terrain, maybe some, I don't know, lighter grass or bushes or smaller trees, whatever. I'll leave that to the interpretation of the mind of the viewer, but it's mostly there to create a little bit of interest, a little bit of an illusion of detail and complexity. But all I'm doing really is just dragging the pencil, creating some random lighter marks. I tried throwing in a little bit of this light yellowish color in some places, didn't really like it that much, so I kind of went over it and softened it a little bit with some of that yellowish green. Anyway, now I'm going to deal with the bottom portion of these trees here at the bottom of that hill or that slope, and you can see how I'm lightly adding some details at the bottom, so that it looks like some parts of those canopies at the bottom of the tree are showing a little bit through the fog. I'm going to add a touch of green as well, and then of course I'm going to do maybe a little bit more blending or a little bit more layering of those lighter grays, but the idea is to make it look like the top part of the tree is emerging or popping out of that mist, while the mist is enveloping the bottom portion or the bottom part of the canopy and the tree. I added a few more peaks there to the right of this distant mountain peak in the middle, so those are also barely visible, popping out of that mist. And now I'm just going to add a few more trees here and there, kind of showing through the thick fog. Just going to go over them a little bit with some lighter pencils to blend in those lighter shapes. And now I'm going to add some more trees here closer to the foreground. I'm starting with a black colored pencil to get some darker shapes in, but those don't have to be too dark. I'm actually using a small amount of pressure, and now I'm going over them with a little bit of green. I'm trying to keep this a little bit lighter because these are in the mist, so I'm gonna have to make them so that, you know, they're sort of barely visible, kind of fading into that mist. I can also make some part of that mist a little bit lighter. It's a little bit tricky to draw because with clouds are a little bit, usually a little bit more defined in terms of shape. Here it's the same thing with smoke. Smoke can also be a little bit better defined. With fog, it's a little bit more challenging. I think it can be a little bit more transparent in some areas, a little bit less in others. It can, I don't know, the shape is very irregular, and it needs to follow the shape and the topography of the terrain. And here at the bottom I'm drawing a darker tree. I'm starting with a black pencil, making sure that I create some really dark shapes and more defined, more elaborate shapes this time, because this tree is closer to our viewpoint, so we're going to need not only more detail but also more contrast, more value, so that the objects which are closer to us are better defined, because the ones which are further away are influenced both by the fog and the atmospheric effect that you always have when you're looking into the distance. So I'm trying to imitate that to create that feeling of distance and depth. but the objects which are closer to us are going to be getting darker and more textured and better defined. Another trick that I'm using here is I'm actually using another black pencil in addition to the Faber-Castell Polychromos black pencil. I also use the Koh-i-Noor Silky black pencil. When you apply them to white paper, they're pretty much the same because the Faber-Castell is already pitch black. But when you put the Koh-i-Noor on top of other layers, it can look a little bit darker. So maybe because it's a little bit softer, it's maybe a different composition, I don't know, but it's just a little bit darker when you apply it on top of the lighter layers. So in order to get some really dark values when I already have some lighter layers underneath, I will often switch from Faber-Castell to the Koh-i-Noor Silky black pencil. Here I added a little bit more of the fog on that slope to the right. I felt like I needed to increase the size of that foggy area and decrease the visible portion of the slope to the right, which is a part of the foreground, because I don't want that element to be too big. I need it to be a little bit smaller because I don't really know what to fill it with, and I have to fill it with something, and it has to be detailed because it is the foreground after all. So I'm going to get there gradually, first by drawing some of these less visible and less defined trees in the fog, and then I'm going to be layering the scene, or putting new layers in the scene by drawing darker and better defined trees in front of those. So here I have another tree. This one is closer to our viewpoint, it's therefore larger than the ones in the back, but it's also more defined, it's a little bit darker. I'm using a little bit more black. I'm going to use a little bit of green on top of it. But you can see that when I'm varying the size of the trees, I'm varying it not only to convey a feeling of distance, but just for the variety itself, because generally speaking, the trees which are further in the distance are going to appear smaller than the ones which are closer to our viewpoint. But even among the trees which are at the same distance, there's going to be a lot of variation in size and shape. So I'm going to draw something like a slightly larger, taller tree here, and then next to it maybe I can draw a lot smaller tree, like maybe a young, shorter tree or something. So trees come in all shapes and sizes, and you want to have a lot of variation if you want to have a convincing looking landscape. So I'm going to add another large, tall tree here on the left. Again, first I drew the vertical line to tell myself where it's going to be and how tall it's going to be, and then I'm working on the horizontal shapes, kind of curving them upwards slightly to imitate the shape and the appearance of those branches and the clusters of needles growing on them, trying to imitate the appearance of an evergreen tree. In some places I can just afford to work a little bit faster, not worry about the smaller shapes that much, and around the edges I have to try to create some more convincing, better defined shapes. Another tree here behind that one, also fairly dark, and then a little bit of shadow on the ground, and then maybe some slightly lighter shapes here. Maybe they can be some other trees or some bushes, doesn't really matter. And then a little bit of variation in the grass with that lighter yellowish green, just to create some illusion like there are some lighter clumps of grass here and there. In order to create those, you don't really have to try to draw every single blade of grass. You can just drag the pencil and allow it to create some random shapes that kind of look like clumps of grass. So I guess some portions of this drawing are, or a lot of it is actually a little bit more on the impressionistic side. but it will still look fairly detailed and convincing once I'm done. Some more trees here, shorter ones, small fair trees there, and then again another slightly larger one here, a little bit darker, a little bit more blending here and there. And then to the right I'm gonna draw a huge tree. This one is going to be very tall and very large because it's basically going to be the closest one to our viewpoint, and I'm just using it to fill in this whole portion of the background to the right. It's going to be stretching out from the midground to the foreground, as it were, because it's covering a portion of the midground. It's covering that misty area in the middle, and it's going to be going all the way down because it's a part of the foreground basically. But because it's a part of the foreground, it also needs to be better defined, so I'm putting a little bit more effort and attention and patience into its shape, adding more of those smaller shapes on the branches and the clusters of needles. I want to make it wide enough so that the width would match its size and height. I want to make the shape make sense and look convincing. This whole middle area is going to be mostly dark. I'm just going to go over that with that black pencil. And I can just modify the shape here and there as I go along. I don't have to get it right all at once. I can add a little bit of shadow on the ground here and there, maybe some other shadows coming from other trees, just playing around with values to make the ground look a little bit more interesting, and then finishing the rest of this large tree in the foreground, dabbing on it a little bit with a brush, because if you feel like there's too much texture, you can always soften it. And then trying to create a more layered scene by drawing some more trees in the mist, and then kind of partly covering them with a little bit more mist so that they're less visible. Adding a few of those in the middle, just adding a little bit more mist, kind of creeping up that slope, following the shape of the terrain, and then blending with a brush, softening some of those marks so that there isn't much texture in that lighter area. But you can't really eliminate all of it, but you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. And just adding a little bit more of that lighter value along the slope and blending that as well, so that there is kind of a more natural transition between that thick fog and the slightly less dense fog stretching out towards the foreground area here, making this part a little bit lighter and more grayish. Between the rows of trees, and just a little bit more blending here as well. Now I'm adding a touch of blue again to the sky, just going over it, grazing over it lightly. And as a final touch, I'm just going to put in a few more trees in the distance, just some peaks, or rather tops or canopies which are visible through the fog, just to give that middle part of the scene some interesting details. And now the drawing is done, I'm going to put my signature here. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. Check out my other videos, and if you want to see a lot more content and longer videos, you should check out my Patreon. Bye bye.